as like a high school student, was preparing himself to be tortured by Polish interrogators one day,
Oh,
beating
come on.
himself and saying, admit Bandera, and he'll be like, no, I won't admit, and burning his fingers on a lamp and putting nails under his fingernails and stuff. So he was always a fanatic.
So yes, Moss, thank you so much for coming on. We have covered your work on, I think, 3 or 4 occasions at this point, and it's been pretty interesting. So thank you for taking the time to like come on and chat with me and talk about some of your work.
Yeah, I really appreciated A, that you went over all this stuff, and B, how you did it.
Nice.
I really appreciated the like extra, context and everything about the Moonies and
Hmm.
World Anti-Communist League with the Arush people, and also it's just, I don't know, I thought your commentary was really funny and
Thank you.
smart, and yeah, and I've
Wow.
enjoyed listening to it.
I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed going through your blog. There's not a lot of people really doing the kind of work you're doing at all. So, how did you get started on the OUNB? So let's kind of start with that, right? Because OUNB is fucking massive. They have had their hand in so much of American politics. They have shaped a lot of the history of Eastern Europe, of Canada. They're all over the fucking place. So, like, who was the OUNB, right? The Order of Ukrainian Nationalists. Who are those guys? Like, I guess, like, we'll start with that.
And well, to answer the first part of your question,
Hmm.
the short version
Yeah.
answer is that for me, this was a historical research project.
Okay.
I got into it because of the whole issue of or debate about neo-Nazis in Ukraine and how real and important this is, starting in 2014 or so. And then
Hmm.
I guess 2015, 2016, I really went down the rabbit hole historically, and I just kind of naively assumed that they would have ceased to exist after
Yeah.
Ukraine became independent. So
You
then
would
it
have thought.
was the spring of 2019 when it first started to dawn on me
Hmm.
that it still exists, and it can be a little overwhelming changing gears from the history to the present day. It's kind of hard to say which is more interesting
Hmm.
because, of course, the present day it's arguably more important,
Yeah.
but with all the declassified documents and hindsight being 2020 or whatever, there's just so much crazy information
Oh my God,
about the
man.
hidden history behind this stuff, and so it'd be easy to spend a whole lifetime just getting into that. I mean, for example, the CIA files, I mean, there's thousands of them. And the thing is, the CIA didn't even support really the OUNB itself, but like a
Hmm.
breakaway faction of OUNB. So I guess answering your question,
Hmm.
um, it started for me with this interest in the story of the CIA playing a role in, um, answering the question, what's the deal with neo-Nazis in Ukraine?
Right.
And but then along the way, realizing the
Longer
CIA didn't,
answer than you expected, huh?
yeah, but the CIA didn't quite work with Bandera, but this other group of ex-Bandera people.
Hmm.
So then in looking into the Bandera thing, I realized that's a whole other thing. And then, but yeah, answering the question who they were and
Hmm.
still are, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN, was founded in 1929 in Vienna. It's always been a far-right fascistic movement,
Hmm.
but it's split in two, with let's see, 1940, 1941. Two factions, OUN-M for Melnik and OUN-B for Bandera. So
Right.
Bandera was the main one and the more radical and extreme, and
Yes.
also the more youthful one.
Hmm.
And so, especially after Bandera's assassination in 1959 by the KGB,
Yeah, they got
um,
his ass. They
yeah,
they invented, if I remember correctly, specifically a wrist-mounted cyanide aerosolizer that they basically the agent had it in his sleeve and broke it, and it sprayed cyanide gas into Bandera's face in a stairwell.
yeah, no, that's a whole crazy
Yeah,
episode.
it's crazy. Homie had
But
it
then
coming.
basically, after Bandera's death, that's when you really get this Bandera cult. And
Yes.
again, long story short, is the CIA had to whitewash, even if it wasn't working with Bandera, it had to whitewash the whole organization of Ukrainian nationalists to
Right.
justify working with this one allegedly democratic faction. And
Yeah.
So in that way, CIA is basically responsible for this whole whitewash narrative that's become completely dominant
Yeah.
today.
And the way people whitewashed the OUNB is absolutely crazy. And I actually saw a new line of whitewashing about the OUNB earlier today. So this person, is just classic fascist stuff. They're saying like, oh, communism was terrible. Anyways, this person tried to. This is a new line. All the stuff Bandera is accused of was actually done by Melnik. So that's a new genocide denial line because that's absolutely not true. Melnik
Oh,
was
wow.
largely out of the picture, right?
Wow.
Like, he was less radical than, he was still a fascist, but he was less radical than Bandera. He was less violent than Bandera, and he was largely muscled out of the Order of Ukrainian Nationalists as like a really important figure, my understanding.
This is a weird narrative. I'm not heard. This is a new one to me.
Yeah, this is like a new narrative. I haven't heard this one before. This was the first time I've seen it. This guy's saying, "Oh, actually, Bandera is being framed, right?" And that's something you actually kind of hear from Yaroslav Stetsko and from LaRouche later on, where they kind of be like, "Oh, the Soviets do character assassination." I think it was Slava Stetsko said, no one's had their character assassinated as much as you have, Mr. LaRouche, for standing up for freedom. Just like they slandered the name of and murdered our hero, Stepan Bandera.
Mm.
Now, so who kind of was Bandera?
Well, for one thing, he was definitely a fascist.
Yeah.
Fun fact, the word for masochism comes
Mhm.
from Lviv or Western Ukraine, or
Yes.
really, I guess you would say Galicia, the part that, because now I don't know how to. There's a Polish or Austrian Polish writer, last name, I don't know if you pronounce it Masoch, but Masoch, I think, and he's credited with being the father or whatever of masochism in
How fun.
literature and whatnot. But so Bandera was a masochist, true to being a true Galician. Actually, I should probably back up. Galicia, basically synonymous with Western Ukraine.
Sure.
But was a kingdom, was the most eastern part of the Austrian Empire, was the kingdom of Galicia, and that's the original part of Galicia corresponded with Western Ukraine, but then that became Eastern Galicia. So then Western Galicia was like southeastern Poland. So the Austrian Galicia was kind of a tale of two cities between Krakow and Lviv, or Lvov, or Lemberg, as the Germans and Austrians called it. But anyways, Bandera was born in the final years of the Austrian Empire. So, he was born an Austrian in a sense. And so the Western Ukrainians were, had, when the Nazis created the SS division they called it the Galician division, and they justified on the basis that they'd been, I guess you'd say, Germanized over the years to some degree, but like there was a kind of grain of truth in that, and they were westernized in all that sense or whatever, but or at least seeing themselves as part of this European family of nations or whatever,
right?
And so, but Bandera was a fascist, but also true to being a real Galician. He was a masochist, and so as like a high school student was preparing himself to be tortured by Polish interrogators one day, beating himself and saying, admit Bandera, and he'll be like, no, I won't admit, and burning his fingers on a lamp and putting nails under his fingernails and stuff. So he was always a fanatic, and he was.
What is he, Albert
he was
fucking Fish?
He was a small guy, so he kind of flew under the radar, and no one suspected that this guy was one of the leaders of the OUN in Galicia or Western Ukraine or Poland, whatever you want to call it.
Like, look at this fucking guy. I'm just imagining him sitting alone in his bedroom, like rubbing and burning his nipples, like, no, I won't admit. I won't admit.
Look up Bandera, like, as a kid or something. Yeah. It's not the
Oh,
one I
here
was
he is
thinking
as a
of, but
teenager.
okay, he was born, I want to say 1907. So by the time he was about 23, 24, 25, he was becoming a leading member of the OUN in Western Ukraine. At that time,
Hmm.
the organization was led from capitals in Western Europe, which were, you know, ones like Berlin and Vienna and Rome, which give you an idea of, the sense of where they were at. There winds up this B versus M conflict, the division in the OUN in 1940-41, largely as a generational conflict between these youngsters led by Bandera who are coming up in the ranks and the exiled older leaders who are World War One veterans.
Right.
And people like Bandera grew up during World War One, but they were too young to fight, so they just kind of soaked in all the nationalism without having to deal with, the horrors of war, at least directly and stuff. So they became even more radical than,
Hmm.
their parents and grandparents' generation.
Great.
But Bandera becomes um, kind of famous in a sense because in 1934 they assassinate the interior minister of Poland, and as a result, actually the gunman gets away, and then
Hmm.
years later is suspected by Washington of being on a mission from the Germans to assassinate FDR. But that
Hmm.
assassination in 1934 of the Polish interior minister gets Bandera and all these other young leaders of the OUN sentenced to death, and then it's commuted to life imprisonment, and then they're freed or released. It's kind of a bit of a mystery exactly what happens, but they all basically are freed one way or another when World
Right.
War II breaks out, and
Yeah.
then Bandera says, "I'm going to be the new leader," and then you have this
Right.
split and yada yada yada. But
Right, and you have the
going
split
back to
between him and Melnik. Yeah.
yeah, but that's a weird narrative about Melnik because yes, the Bandera people were more radical,
Hmm.
but the Melnik people, I mean, the Melnik people were the ones who were basically taking the position of let's just put our head down and work with the Germans and
Yeah.
hope that at the end of the war we get rewarded with a free
Hmm.
Ukraine. And the Bandera people are saying we're not going to wait for that. We're going to,
Do it now.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
and the Banderites, like it was like the OUNB and the UPA, for example, that carried out the massacre in the Volhynia and the massacre in Lviv. And they seem to have this impression that if they were very active and very violent, that they would prove their worth and they would get like an independent country right away. They would get like their own little puppet state. And they founded. I think it was right after the massacre, the pogrom in Lviv, that they established the independent Ukrainian state in paper for like a week on June 30th, 1941 in Lviv, right? Am I remember that correctly?
yeah, they did that, declared it on the 30th, and also on the 30th started to organize this militia, which then spearheaded these pogroms in Western
Right.
Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, within like a week or so, Bandera and Stetsko and others were arrested. But there's kind of the BS narrative is that that's what
Yes.
made them go, why they were put in concentration camps as VIPs, really. But which people might find hard to believe, but that was basically, I mean, that was a thing. They all survived the war with just a few exceptions, and they were let go in 1944.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say. They were, if I remember correctly, they were put in prison for like a couple months and then kept on house arrest for quite some time and then put back in later and then
Well,
released again, if I remember
they
correctly.
they were brought to Berlin and
Hmm.
placed under house arrest, but it wasn't even really house arrest because they were allowed. They just couldn't leave Berlin, and then Stetsko, I think, got permission once
Hmm.
to leave Berlin to liaison with maybe Lebed or one of the other top OUNB people.
Okay.
And even in that time, when they were under house, quote unquote, house arrest, and then even in, I think, when they were initially put into concentration camps,
Hmm.
they were still trying to get the word out that, don't resist the Germans, try to work with them or infiltrate
Yes.
them. So they didn't really, the only period of alleged anti-Nazi resistance was a period in 1943 to 44.
Hmm.
And even that, it's not, what they like to say it was.
No.
Um,
there's
Yeah.
a bullshit narrative, right? That, oh, no, Bandera wasn't a Nazi collaborator. He worked with them for just a little bit, but, the Nazis threw him in jail, and, he was just a committed nationalist, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all fucking bullshit. He was a fan of the Nazis. He worked with the Nazis for years because he saw their vision as being very compatible with his vision. And they only worked against the Nazis for a brief period for issues of practicality. They were fascist, anti-communist first and foremost, right? They helped perpetrate the fucking Holocaust. Like they don't get to say that, but people will try to sanitize him. And I mean, for fuck's sake, right? Leave, which is Bandera's hometown, before the UPA and the OUNB got there, there was 110,000 Jewish residents. It was one of the largest Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. It was 1/3 of the population of the town was Jewish. Nowadays, there's 1,200 Jews. They killed all of them. The UPA, and then with the help of the Einsatzgruppen, they killed fucking all of them. And in 2018, the mayor of Lviv declares 2018 the year of Bandera to honor his memory. Like, imagine how you fucking feel if you were one of those few Jewish residents left in the town, and the guy who murdered your grandparents gets a full fucking year named after him. Like, people just keep trying to sanitize his legacy, and I mean, couldn't they pick a different Ukrainian folk hero?
Yeah, and it's no wonder, that the whole whitewashing of Azov and other neo-Nazis in Ukraine is basically just, doing the same thing all over again, but just to a even more blatant. Because I personally, the Bandera and them, they weren't really Ukrainian Nazis as much as they were Nazi collaborators. Like they were the equivalent of Nazis.
Right. Yes, they were the indigenous equivalent of Nazis, just like the Ustase was.
But then, Azov and stuff like that are just blatant neo-Nazis.
Correct.
And yet doesn't make a difference. I mean, that's the part I'm still. It's like I can, because I sort of understand the history. I can like wrap my head around the whitewashing of OUN.
Sure.
But I can't wrap my head around the way people can dismiss evidence of like blatant Nazism on the internet with like the NAFO founder, and then I just wrote a thing that I was scrambling to finish before coming on here about this famous photographer from Azov. He's I mean, it's like no surprise, but at the same time, it's kind of mind blowing how.
And we will talk about that one, in a second. But you're right, like OUNB, right? That was a while ago. That was long enough ago that there's enough Cold War propaganda. There's enough distance, there's enough obfuscation, and they spent the better half of the 20th century trying to rewrite them as these brave anti-communist freedom fighters. And there was a lot of work that was spent rewriting that narrative, right? They collaborated with all sorts of people who were in high power. And as a matter of fact, according to your reporting, the current head of the OUNB met with the head of the Democratic Progressive Caucus like a month ago to get them to pull back their anti-Ukraine war funding trial balloon.
He's not the head internationally, but he might be, because he's probably a contender to be one of the next ones. Yeah.
So I'm going to spread misinformation on purpose, and I'm going to, you can do nuance. I'm going to lie and say that he's the head of the OUNB, because that makes it easier to remember in my head. But it's crazy, though.
He's definitely up there.
Right. Well, these people that are like working with this network of anti-communists, and when we get into like Yaroslav Stetsko running the world, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, working with the World Anti-Communist League, like the people who were in the World Anti-Communist League and the ABN that were working with Singlob and Reagan and the Moonies, Reverend Moon and LaRouche, like these are who's who of people who really should have been handed over to the Soviets. Because, like, we're talking, like, members of Romanian Iron Guard, we're talking members of the Croatian Ostase, we're talking Yaroslav and Slava Stetsko, Chiang Kai-shek, all of the worst people in the 20th century, all in one place. And, if those were enemies of the United States, they would be rightfully painted as some of the greatest monsters of the 20th century. But instead, they're, brave freedom fighters.
Well, but then you have people like Singlaub who lived to be 100 years old. I think he died like last year or this
Yeah.
year. I mean, all these evil people live forever. It's
No, they do. I mean, they all live forever, right? Like Singlaub like got away with all of his crimes, right? Like it's honestly, LaRouche died at 96, right? Like this is a man who spent his whole life spreading evil, and he dies at the ripe old age of 96. Like, I guess the universe is stacked in favor of truly evil people. But when we get to the modern day whitewashing of Nazis in Ukraine, like Azov, and then Right Sector, Right Sector is a direct descendant of the OUNB. Like they're a direct descendant of them. Banderites are alive and well. We've all seen the photos of the mayors with pictures of Bandera behind them, the Savoba Party marches, torchlit marches with pictures of Bandera in the OUNB colors. But when it gets to these actual, like, open neo-Nazis like Azov, it's so weird when you see these people like, well, other streamers like Dylan Burns or the mainstream media, where they don't distance themselves at all. You really think that they would take a more reasonable line and go something like, well, we don't support the Nazis. We think the Nazis are pretty bad. We're calling on the United States to, not support these Nazis in specific, right? But we support the full funding of the Ukraine war or whatever. They don't do that. They just straight up say, yeah, the Azov people are fucking heroes. They're heroes and they should be honored. They should be lauded. Like the New York Times referring to them as the heroes of Ukraine. Zelensky giving them medals. Like the whole press tour with the Azov wives. It's really crazy. Like they are straight up just openly promoting and whitewashing Nazis rather than making the reasonable position of just distancing themselves from Nazis. They're saying, what Nazis? They're not Nazis. That guy with the Totenkopf tattoo, he just likes skulls.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was definitely the norm from until this year. Now it's become everyone's just openly glorifying them and going all the way. And it's still, hard to get over.
Yes, and there was a story I'm trying to find.
Not that anyone should get over it, but,
Right,
But when you say Azov is direct descendant, I would say really Right Sector is more a direct descendant of OUNB.
No,
I
literally.
see because they're... the hardcore Ukrainian nationalists are Western Ukraine, and Azov actually did start in Eastern Ukraine, largely Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And there's a significant, or let's say not insignificant, number of neo-Nazis from Russia who are in Azov. And so I think a lot of the hardcore, swastikas on their chest Nazis in Ukraine, I think they see themselves more as like successors to the nationalist movement as opposed to the direct descendants, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like the neo-Nazis, overt neo-Nazis in Ukraine are more likely to see themselves as, be talking about, or they're going to be more likely to be into pagan shit and Vikings and Pan-Slavic, whatever. Yeah, whereas the Bandera people, they're capital N nationalists, as in Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So I do think, there's definitely a gray area between the two, but I think there is kind of a distinction to be made between the neo-nationalists and the neo-Nazis. And like Right Sector is kind of, like in the middle somewhere, because it has both. But it was spearheaded by this organization that basically translates to the trident of Stepan Bandera.
Oh, great.
And that was created as a paramilitary arm for the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was created as the OUNB political party, co-founded by Slava Stetsko, who gave that interview with the LaRouche magazine, and a Ukrainian-American guy, Roman Zavarich, who, I'm less clear on him, but he was a manager for Azov's Civic Corps, which was the predecessor to its political party, the National Corps. And he, apparently they had some kind of falling out. But, that's at least one example of a pretty strong OUNB to Azov connection. But
Right.
I think the OUNB links are stronger to the
Right sector.
right sector, but then also the like people who, you know, if you're trying to be like, the more time I spend on this, the more annoying I get with trying to be nuanced and whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
so I look at right sector and the Svoboda Party more as crypto Nazi than
Sure.
full blown Nazi, but I would say that those kinds of neo Nazis or crypto Nazis, whatever you want to call them,
Mm-hmm.
they're the ones that have a more direct connection to OUNB. So like the Svoboda Party, um, its chief ideologist and I think also the head of its political education are both OUNB people.
Great.
Like actually members of OUNB.
Right.
Um, so I think OUNB is probably closest to Svoboda Party and to a lesser extent right sector. And there's like a couple loose connections we made to Azov, but then
Mm-hmm.
they were all united against Zelensky.
Yes.
So which I think is really important. And I think, that alliance is, definitely played a role in sabotaging the peace agenda or the mandate for peace that Zelensky had when he was elected.
Yes.
And
I mean, there's that footage of them saying to him when he goes and begs them to lay down their arms, they say, fuck off. And he's like on the verge of crying, saying, he's like, I'm the president. You can't call me a pussy. And, the implication being there, well, we overthrew the government once in 2014. Don't think we won't do it to you. We have more weapons than we did back then.
mhm. Yeah. And they, also around that time, there was a member of parliament from the previous president,
Mhm.
Poroshenko's party.
Mm-hmm.
And she made a comment, something like, oh, Zelensky should be careful at the front because a grenade might go off. And I forget how exactly she put it, but she was, I think, actually charged by the government of Ukraine for threatening Zelensky's life. And,
Jeez.
right after the election, where she was elected to parliament that summer, she went to Chicago and met with OUNB people in Chicago. So I heard that she had something to do with OUNB. I'm kind of skeptical about it, but this anti-Zelensky movement, they were all working together, and I'm not trying to justify or excuse Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
No, of course
which
not.
was obviously horrible, but I do think that it's questionable if it would have happened had it not had Zelensky's peace agenda was completely sabotaged
Right.
by these people.
I mean, you have people like, Mearsheimer. I've talked about this quite a bit, but like Mearsheimer has talked about, that the United States positioning with Ukraine post-Maidan pretty much guaranteed that a war was eventually going to happen by shifting the balance of power there. And I think, if his peace agenda hadn't been sabotaged, and I think the U.S. probably told him, no, we'll keep going. We've got your back. Using Ukraine, as one pro-Ukraine American said, as NATO's crumple zone. And there's an article I was trying to find I saw earlier today. There was a couple I saw earlier today. But one of them was that Congress has, here it is. Congress has, once again, they have removed their ban from funding neo-Nazis. So this never stopped Azov from getting weapons. Azov was always getting weapons, but they were officially banned again in 2018 from receiving direct military aid. It was basically just like an addendum that military funding to Ukraine can't go to open Nazis. There were plenty of incidents, such as a incident where $500,000 of Aerotronic PSLR-1 rocket launchers somehow ended up in the hands of Azov. But Congress has removed its ban on funding neo-Nazis from its year-end spending bill. Under pressure from the Pentagon, Congress has stripped the spending bill of an amendment that had prevented funds from falling into the hands of neo-fascist groups. On December 2015, Congress passed a 2,000-plus page omnibus spending bill. Both parties were quick to declare victory after the passage of the $1.8 trillion package. So let's see. They talked about $64 billion for overseas contingency operations for European countries facing Russian aggression. Very cool. So it had in it an amendment that limits arms training and other assistance to Ukrainian neo-Nazi militia, the Azov Battalion, which passed by unanimous vote. So Congress was calling Azov a neo-Nazi militia. Yet the New York Times and all these other people are happy to say that they're no longer fascist.
Yeah, it was pretty uncontroversial to call them neo-Nazi or openly neo-Nazi until earlier this year.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we have right here, somebody in chat showed me a picture of an Azov soldier who died in bravery of Mariupol defenders recalled at Kyiv funeral. And the guy's coffin's got a fucking Wolfsangel on it. Like, are you kidding, man?
A lot of the whitewashing of Azov is kind of centered around this narrative that was already thrown around, years ago, but was debunked. But for whatever reason, well, it's not really a mystery that it's come back, is this myth that Azov depoliticized and that, there's there's a branch in the National Guard. They have a political party. They have other wings and associated stuff going on. But there's this idea that they're not all like one coordinated movement, and that basically the neo-Nazis left the battalion or the regiment
they were
when they
drummed
formed the
out or
political
whatever.
party. Yeah, but that's completely, there's just no evidence for it. Yeah, the people who make this argument never really back it up.
No, they just say it.
There's a small handful of BS articles that anytime you tweet about this stuff or anytime I write about Azov, the same articles get spammed by like NAFO people or like-minded trolls. And but there's really no truth to it. And I hate to recommend reading anything published by the Atlantic Council, but there's a great blog on the Atlantic Council by Alexei Kuzmenko, who I think really is the best when it comes to neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And he writes something like Azov has not depoliticized. And that was true. He wrote that maybe 2020, but it's still true today. And I'm not really the best one to make that argument or counter argument, but there's just so many examples to show that this narrative is completely BS, has no truth whatsoever. But it does echo back to the evidence-free whitewash narratives that people associate with the CIA, top down, all kinds of people propagated about the OUN that they weren't Nazi collaborators. No, they didn't kill Jews. They fought the Nazis and they saved Jews.
Yeah. Oh my God.
I mean, that's a whole thing. I mean, that this myth about the OUN and its Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA or UPA, that they saved Jews, like systematically.
Oh, really? The guys who dragged all the Jewish residents out of their houses, sexually assaulted them in public, stripped them naked, and then marched them to a stadium for execution. They just had to kill some of them to fool the Nazis so they could really go save the rest of them. Are you fucking kidding me?
Well, because they kept alive some doctors and stuff.
How nice of them!
Mysteriously, none of these doctors survived the war because as the Soviets were approaching, they apparently killed them all. The UPA, OUN, UPA created, or maybe in particular its security service arm, created like its own little concentration camps on farms and stuff. And I'm pretty sure there's no known survivors from that. So they killed them all and then they claimed that they saved Jews. They also went so far as to forge at least one or two memoirs allegedly by Jews crediting the Ukrainian nationalist movement with saving them. And then it comes out that the name was Stella K something, but she didn't exist, not a real person.
Nice. Of course.
I found another example, probably someone who doesn't exist, in Ukrainian or OUNB newspaper, and it's written by someone who's described as a famous patriot in Israel, but you can't. I think his name is David Belamud, but if you Google him, you'll find nothing but a link to this PDF where he's saying, is there discrimination in Israel today? If so, then against one group only, the Ukrainians, because at that time you have the
What?
Ivan Demjanjuk case ongoing, and everything, this whole topsy-turvy world they're living in with Ukrainian Nazis and stuff, they're the pioneers of just turning everything on its head. From
Right.
we weren't foot soldiers in the Holocaust. We were, we should be the first. Oh, also, there's a something called the International Committee of Ukrainian Political Prisoners. Well, actually, scratch that. If you go, there's a Bandera museum, private Bandera museum in London, and I've never had the quote unquote pleasure of going, but the author of the Bandera biography, it's called Stepan Bandera: Life and Afterlife of a Ukrainian Nationalist, Genocide, Fascism, Cult. Like everyone who wants to know more than the kind of surface level stuff we're getting into today should definitely check out that book. But he talks about how if you go there, you get the impression that Ukrainians were the principal victims of the Holocaust. They have no mention of Jews, but then they have these, like drawings of all the Ukrainian nationalist leaders in concentration camps. Like they're, this idea that they were persecuted for being Ukrainian, and for that reason only, not because, they had a political conflict with the Nazis, which we basically already laid this out. But in short, these OUN and these nationalists, they weren't anti-Nazi. The Nazis were just extremely anti-Ukrainian. I think Eric Koch, the head of the I'm gonna mispronounce this, but the Reichskommissariat, or the Nazi authority in Soviet Ukraine, he once said that if there's a Ukrainian worthy of sitting at the same table as me, I would have him shot. I mean, so these people were not going to support a free Ukraine or liberated, independent Ukraine or whatever.
Right. No, of course not. But Ukrainians thought they were going to. They thought they could convince them to. I mean, of course, the OUNB and the UPA people didn't know about General Plan Ost. But with the benefit of hindsight, they spin that narrative that they were actually the victims in all of this. They were the victims of a planned genocide. They were the victims of the Nazis, even though they were collaborating. These people were collaborating with the Nazis. And once again, the majority of Ukrainian citizens who fought in World War II fought on the side of the Red Army, fought in the Red Army, right? These people were not popular. My understanding is the UPA and OUNB were not particularly popular in Ukraine. They had plenty of collaborators, but they weren't a massive force.
That was the other myth throughout the Cold War, is that they were representatives of this resistance movement throughout Ukraine that was popular and democratic and just wanted to bring democracy or whatever. And that was never the case.
And that's a narrative I see exploited by fascists a lot. And this is actually something similar I see from three-stripe fascists who call themselves anarchists out of Vietnam, where it's a sort of idea that, that socialism must be upheld to an absurd purity test, that if there is a single person who says, I do not consent to socialism, and they're forced into it, then it's evil and bad and needs to be thrown out. And they always point to these cases of individual fascists or fascist groups who are suppressed by socialists, and they're like, see, it was bad. These people represent the real will of the people. And it's like, well, there's 1,000 of them, and they're doing war crimes. They do not represent the general will of the people. They represent fascism. And it's like an impossible purity test that they always say. I don't fucking care about those people. I don't care about your what the Red Army did to your OUNB grandpa. I don't fucking care. But it's, something you see all the time.
Yeah.